Hi, we continue in Luke 14 in the fourth course of what Lyle Story calls the four-course meal scene here in Luke 14. And to set our context, as we've been doing, I see on the right side of the screen, we're working our way through the journey to Jerusalem chiasm that began in 951 and goes all the way to 1910. And we went through Jesus' lament over Jerusalem a couple of videos ago, and the man with dropsy, and now we're going through these various scenes here in chapter 14, which are chiastically connected, as we'll see soon, with the lost parables in chapter 15, which is to say, chapter 14, as we've been looking at, is addressed to the elite Romans in Luke's audience about their solidarity with their peers or their solidarity with the poor. And then in chapter 15, we'll see God's perspective on those who are left out of those celebrations under the threefold category of lost: coins, sheep, and then a lost son. So this is all continuous within that section. And as we can see now on the right side of the screen, we're in this scene here. This element of the meal scene, the fourth element, starting with the man with dropsy, the issue of the seats, the question of lunch or dinner invitations is now the question of invitations to a great supper and what happens there. And so as we go through that, it's really important to note a couple of things. Although the meal scenes here show this as chiastic with Levi's great banquet and as a representative of the Pharisees here, leading some scholars to see this as a rejection. The Pharisees are rejecting Jesus' call, so it's going to be turned over to the Gentiles, with the Pharisees as a representative of the Jews. But with great irony, I'd suggest it's exactly the opposite, that the Pharisees are representative of the Romans. For Luke's audience, he couldn't just put young Romans directly in there. That would have been too controversial, both for his readers and perhaps for Roman officials who might be watching or reading or listening from a distance. So he uses the Pharisees, whom the narrator later will call silver lovers, as a stand-in for the young adults who are being formed to take their place within the Roman world of hierarchy and class solidarity amongst the elite, and the patron-client system that binds the poor below to the wealthy elite above. And so this is not about whether Gentiles are invited versus Jews. It's about whether, when the rich invite the poor, as Jesus tells them to do, would their rich friends come to, or will their rich friends say, I want nothing further to do with you for your violation of class solidarity and standing against us by treating the poor as if they're people entitled to seats at our banquets. So that's what the issue is here, and it has nothing to do with the question of Gentiles. Similarly, the host of the banquet, as some scholars just routinely put in parentheses, this is God, is the exact opposite of God. Anybody who reads this story as if this is Luke's presentation of God has really not read Luke's gospel. Because as we'll see, this is someone who doesn't care about the poor whatsoever. What he cares about is his reputation in an empty banquet hall. So he's going to force the poor to do his bidding, as the rich always do. So he's not shown any conversion at all. What he's going to show, as we'll see, is anger that his peers are rejecting him. And so it has nothing to do with either the Gentiles coming or nothing to do with God punishing people. This is just a representation of the cost of discipleship to the rich. And as we'll see, what follows as we look back at the sequence are stories about hating family, carrying the cross, and planning for a tower, building a tower or a battle, which is to say anticipating the consequences of your choices in advance. If the person in our story here had known that his elite friends were not going to accept his invitation, he wouldn't have invited them in the first place. In fact, he wouldn't have put on the meal, because it's a great shame, public shame to him. So that's what we'll see is at issue here. And as I showed last time, the four groups of people who are named as the people you shouldn't invite lest they invite you back in the last scene, rejecting the sense of balanced reciprocity by which friendships and solidarity are maintained by I invite you and then you invite me, and we invite each other to show that we see each other as peers and equals. But instead he says at a fancy meal, not at the same meal, but at a fancy meal, which is the one that links the meal scenes here, at a dokan here, not at an ariston, which is a simple breakfast, then back over to here, then you invite these people. And if you do, as we'll see, these people, represented by the people in our story that make excuses, will make excuses and will try to embarrass you as much as they can by saying, we've heard rumors about you and we're not having anything to do with you at all, which would be a huge price to pay, as it is today in cancel culture or other forms of that, where people in the public eye make choices that the crowd or their peers reject and can cost them much in reputation as well as in money. So that's what's at issue in our scene here. And as we look at the key words, we're going to see here that this phrase that we saw last time, your friends, brothers, relatives, or rich neighbors, is paralleled by these people. It's obviously not the same word, but it's parallel there. And notice throughout, it's the slave that does his bidding. And we see that repeated throughout here. So this is not like a messenger, like God sends a messenger. This is plainly a slave who has no will whatsoever and is carrying it out. It shows the attitude of the person involved here. So let's, with no further ado, turn to our story, and it starts in verse 16. After one of the dinner guests, on hearing this, which is, say, Jesus says, invite the poor, the lame, etc., offers in this challenge, which is a little bit hidden behind the translation of the New RSV here. Blessed is not anyone, but whomever will eat bread in the kingdom of God. In other words, what he's saying is against Jesus saying that those who practice balanced reciprocity are not doing God's will. He's saying anybody who will eat bread in the kingdom of God is blessed. And although it doesn't say so, many scholars assume, and it may well make sense to assume, that as Israelites or as Judeans, they're entitled to eat bread in the kingdom of God, much like what the response of John the Baptist was to those in the beginning who said, what should we do? And he responds, don't presume to say, we have Abraham for our father. God can raise up children to Abraham from these stones. And although Abraham is not at issue right here, we saw earlier that the description of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as we see here, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and all the prophets in the kingdom of God, and you yourselves thrown out. So that would certainly invoke the element of Abraham, as we see there. So Jesus addresses this person here, the one who objects, this way. Someone, literally, anthropos tis, just somebody, gave a great dinner. And the phrase deep non mega is here and in 2046 in Luke. Let's look at it there and we can see. Beware the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. And guess what? To have the best seats in the synagogues and in places of honor at banquets, using the same word here. So exactly what we saw earlier about people struggling for places. And the scribes here may, in chapter 20, represent the Judean scribes who interpret the law against Jesus, but they can also represent the educated elite amongst the Romans as well. Certainly a Roman audience would hear in those Judean scribes people who are educated like themselves. So he invited many, and notice it doesn't say what kind of people were invited here, but it's a key theme, this call theme that we've seen throughout, as we see here. So, what's at issue in these dinner invitations is culturally what they meant. And for a number of years, Kenneth Bailey's view and the view of Neri and Rohrbaugh from a social science perspective have dominated scholarship. But more recently, as we'll see, Van Eck's view challenges that from the perspective of community gossip. So we'll see differing scholarly views of what's going on as we go. So at the time for the dinner, and this is where the controversy is. So Rohrbaugh and Neri say this kind of double invitation was not uncommon among the upper classes of the city and would have several purposes. Initially, the potential guest would have to decide if this was a social obligation he could afford to return in kind, that referring to the issue of balanced reciprocity that we saw in the last video. The time between invitations would allow opportunity for potential guests to find out what the festive occasion might be, who was coming, and whether all had been done appropriately. And similarly, we see here a story noting just a different contrast. The host invites people to a celebration of life, which makes its blatant and abusive rejection all the more monstrous. And we'll look at the Deuteronomy issues in a moment. But this is where Van Eck argues strenuously against Bailey and Rohrbaugh and Neri, who are suggesting that the two invitations are an opportunity to find out who's coming, and then once you know who's coming, to make the appropriate amount of food. And so if people don't come after the meal is ready, then you're forced forcing the host to destroy food and expense that was prepared for nobody. But Van Eck says that's completely wrong. And he says, as you can see in my note below, the purpose of the first invitation is neither to give ample notice of an occasion that is going to take place, nor to ascertain the number of guests who will attend. It is also not an invitation that expects an answer. It is an honor challenge to the invited. On the day of the feast, the second invitation goes out, not only to those who accepted the first invitation, but again to all the invited. Put differently, on the day of the feast, the host in essence inquires about his honor rating in the community. So as we look at these excuses, we'll have to see, is this something at the last minute that is causing the host a problem because the food is ready? Or is this something that's been talked about in the background, and we'll have to figure out, since we're not going to have access to the background, what's going on? So with those two possibilities in mind, let's listen closely to what they say. But they all alike began to make excuses from one. And as Rohrbach and Neri say below, the dynamics of dinner invitations in pre-industrial societies are revealed here. Either all the guests come or none do, because none would risk coming to a banquet shunned by important others. And they go on further, elite Christians within Luke's own community refusing table fellowship with the poor. I disagree completely with what they say there, and I just want to highlight that. First of all, the word Christians is completely anachronistic here. There's nothing in Luke's gospel to suggest that any of these people following Jesus understand themselves as anything but Judeans who are choosing the way of Jesus, just like Judeans who might choose the way of the Pharisees, or Judeans later who might choose the way of Saul of Tarsus, etc. So the word Christian is just completely wrong there. But I'd like to suggest that what Luke's addressing here is not Christians, but Romans who are considering whether to follow Jesus, and showing them what would happen to them if they participate in Jesus' way. Not that they're doing this, but to warn them ahead, just as the later sections of this chapter prepare them to be prepared, as in the issue of carrying the cross and the invitation to plan for a tower or a battle. So they all began to make excuses, using this word here, parithestai here in the next verse. And as Rohrbach and Neri add again, their excuses are standard fare in the dynamics of honor-shame societies. The point is not the excuses at hand, but the social disapproval of the arrangements being made. And that much is certainly true. So let's look at them, and then we'll look at more detail. The first said to him, I have bought a piece of land, and I must go out and see it. Please accept my regrets. And as Bailey notes below, no one in the Middle East would buy a field without having walked every square inch of it. He continues, in a world of increasing population, limited land space, and the growth of a landless tenantry, the host of the banquet is to believe that a field has been suddenly bought sight unseen. He is intentionally insulting the host by offering an obviously false excuse. Let's get at the details. The bought expresses other issues about buying earlier. The piece of land, agron, indicates agricultural land, so it's consonant with the second person who bought oxen. The oxen could be for the same piece of land, for all we know, although different people. And I must go out and see it. Not the divine necessity, dei, but ananken here, implying an element of distress or emergency. And the idea that it's an emergency is absurd, of course. The land is still going to be there, and he's already bought it. The please accept my regrets is much more polite than what the Greek actually is. There's no please at all. And as we see, the word for regret here is the same one for excuses here. And so it's used both times. So please accept my excuse. It doesn't even rise to the level of a regret. Let's look at the second one, and then we'll come back and see the Deuteronomy passage. Another said, I have bought 5 yokes of oxen, and Marshall notes suggest a farmer of some means, since in general 1 or 2 pairs of oxen were adequate for a small farm. And indeed, 5 yoke of oxen, a yoke meaning 2 of them, is a lot of oxen. And he would certainly need slaves and others, since obviously he can't man 5 yokes of oxen himself. So another person who matches the element of your relatives or your friends or your rich neighbors. I'm going to try them out. And as Bailey notes, this obviously takes place before the buyer even begins to negotiate a price. Again, the excuse offered is a transparent fabrication. And then the final one has a little element of humor that most scholars are too prudish to note here, but Longenecker highlights for us here. Another said, I have just been married and therefore I cannot come. And he notes the threefold pattern in the first excuses, common in folklore, where there's three problems and one solution. And he says, although the person who bought the land says, I must go out and see it, and the oxen purchaser says, I'm going to try them out, this one just says, I've been married and I cannot come, which implies I must go try her out, which is ironically the only one of them that would be true. That the person who bought the land or the oxen would obviously have seen the land or the oxen before they purchased it. And the man might have seen the woman, but he wouldn't have sexually tried her out before the wedding. So those are all obviously what we might call BS excuses. Many scholars have noted it echoes from this passage from Deuteronomy, offering excuses for not going to war. So let's listen to this in comparison. Then the official shall address the troops, saying, Has anyone built a new house but not dedicated it? He should go back to his house, or he might die in the battle, and another dedicate it. Has anyone planted a vineyard but not yet enjoyed its fruit? He should go back to his house, or he might die in the battle, and another be first to enjoy its fruit. Has anyone become engaged to a woman but not yet married her? He should go back to his house, or he might die in the battle, and another marry her. So similarities, but also differences. And notice that all of those, there's no suggestion, other than in the marriage one, that he hasn't seen the house or he hasn't seen the vineyard or familiar with it. And of course, it's just planted. So, he knows it because he planted it. But the issue is life and death. The reason for the excuses are that if they die in battle, they won't get to enjoy their house or their fruit or their new wife. But there's no life and death situation in this banquet at all, unless the people making excuses see it that way. Not literally as life and death, but as social life and death. That if they accept this invitation to someone who's apparently rumored to be considering inviting people below their class and station to come, then that would ruin their reputation for being associated with that. And I can't give enough examples from our culture where that exact kind of thing happens, where there's a meal or an occasion where the homeless or the poor or people of color or immigrants or wherever the other is that one elite group thinks doesn't belong there is invited to come, and people don't like it. It reminds me of Lenny Bruce's old piece about Christ and Moses coming in to the big cathedral in New York City, and the bishop not knowing what to do when the poor and the lepers all follow the train of Jesus and Moses into the church and leave body parts and stink behind them. And the respectable people in the church are obviously bothered by that. So maybe not a lot has changed. So as we continue after the excuses, we'll scroll down to see the rest of our scene here. So now we have the resolution. And here's where my note below shows that Longnecker, the pattern that I mentioned. So the slave returned and reported this to his master, using the word report we always see. And now suddenly the owner of the house is a lord, is a kurios. That doesn't make it God. Obviously, there are many secular, if you will, lords and masters throughout the Roman world, and which is why kurios becomes a word for a god, because it's used in the secular way, not the other way around. So then the owner of the house, as Lord, connecting with the owners of the house we saw in two previous scenes, and I won't go back to those now, but you can see those. I went back to them last time, and became angry. Orgizo, and there's only one other use of the orgizo, and I think it's very revealing for what's in common with these scenes. If we want to think for a second that the owner of the house is God, who's angry that people reject the invitation, let's note here in 1528 that the one who becomes angry here is the elder son, who refuses to go in because the younger son has been invited to the party, and his cry is, I have never disobeyed you, yet you've never given me even a young goat that I may celebrate with my friends. So both the elder son and the owner of the house are people who are angry because the prospect of sharing a meal with their friends has been thwarted. And so that's the relationship here. And plainly, nobody thinks the elder son is a God figure. It's the father in that story that's usually understood to be the God figure. And this anger does not lead to love or compassion or conversion. It leads to domination and force, as we see right now. First to the slaves and then to the poor. So go out at once, and we have to be careful there because the new RSV translates badly words that are very different. Streets and lanes. Streets is plateas, which is the wide, broad streets. It literally means broad streets. But as Rohrbeck and Neri note below, most streets were unpaved, narrow, badly crowded, and would not have allowed passage of wheeled vehicles. Many would have been choked with refuge and frequented by scavenging dogs, pigs, birds, and other animals, as you can see from this painting of the poor parts of the streets of Rome. And that's following not from the streets, but the word lanes there, rumos, as Rohrbeck and Neri add, the narrow streets and alleys along which the poorest of the non-elite people live. And that's what we see in this image here. So bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame, exactly those who we were told to be invited into the meals. And the slave said, "Sir, what you ordered has been done." Notice it happens with no time passing at all. And imagine how difficult that would be. Does a slave go out by himself into the back alleys of whatever street the stories, whatever city the story is meant to take place in, and tell the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame, "Come with me"? The crippled who probably can't walk, the blind who can't see, the lame who also have trouble walking, and why would they believe this person? So there'd be a lot of resistance, and yet no resistance is noted, because that's not the point here. The point is about the condition of the owner of the house. So what you ordered here, epitaxis, only Jesus uses the word otherwise, although there are other command words you can see down there. And there is still room, or literally, there is still a place. And that's what we see here, echoing the issue of the places that people were taking when they were competing for seats up above. So then the master said to the slave, "Go out," and notice if we see streets and lanes and roads and lanes, it sounds similar, but it's not. The streets were the main part, the lanes are the back roads. Now we're into the ways, which are to say the unpaved roads, the dirt roads, and the lanes, the phragmos, which doesn't mean roads at all. It means fenced in or walled places, which is how it's used in these other places. For the fence around a vineyard, or in Ephesians for a dividing wall between Jews and Gentiles. So it's into the fenced in places, in other words, where the poor are fenced out of being part of the urban area. As Rohrbeck and Neri note below, the area immediately outside the city was inhabited by both outcasts and those requiring access to the city, but not permitted to live within it. So these would be the homeless people and beggars and people who don't even have access to the city people to beg from, the lowest of the low. And what the slave is told is to compel them to come in, using this strong word for necessity here. And as Rohrbeck and Neri rightly add below, such people would have immediately understood the invitation as an inexplicable breach of the system. Considerable compulsion would have been required to induce them to attend the supper. They are wary outsiders who are rightly suspicious of those who break the system. And as I was preparing for this video, it immediately reminded of my beloved friend Edward Loring of the Open Doors community. I was discussing about 40 years ago, or more than that, when they were young, excited, radical pastors, he and his new wife Murphy, in the city of Atlanta, and pastoring a Presbyterian church, and on fire with the gospel and with the history of racism in the South, where they were in Georgia and where he grew up in South Carolina, and decided they wanted to help black poor people find a place to live and treat them well. So they went around in a van and found poor black people on the streets at night and said, "Would you like to come into our van and we'll give you a place of shelter?" Naively, not recognizing what of course they recognized immediately was a white person in a van at night saying to a black person on the street of Atlanta, "Get into my van and I will help you," would probably not be perceived as good news. So they had to come up with other ways to do it, and they used the church basement as a way with an invitation. And that's something what I think we're expected to hear. These people would not want to come in at all. They would know something is suspicious, and they suspect rightly they're being used. And yet, interestingly, this part of the story is not narrated. The first part was done, as we see in verse 22, without any word of description, and this part is narrated as a thing to do, but it's never announced whether it's successful or not. But it completes, not with a word from Jesus, as we saw last time, but with the word from the owner of the house, "For I tell you, none of those who are invited will taste my dinner." There's a word play in there. We won't look at the detail here. And the word for taste we've seen a couple of times before. And so it changes scenes we see in verse 25. So what is that telling us here as we prepare to take on the next scene? This very Roman person, not like God at all, has apparently been rumored in the gossip mill, the Van Eck notes, that he's considering breaking class solidarity and inviting others. And as soon as there's a whiff of that, all his rich friends and neighbors not only refuse to come, but they make transparent excuses that echo each other to highlight we're basically giving you the social finger. We're basically saying we want nothing to do with you, and we're really kind of embarrassed that you would so shame yourself as to suggest that somehow you're better off by inviting all the nobodies rather than the somebodies to your dinner. Which is why the story continues in Luke 14, with Jesus giving them strong warnings about calculating the cost of your choices before you make them. And that's where we'll go next time, to the challenge of hating family and carrying the cross. See you then for that. Bye-bye.